Good afternoon, welcome. My name is Karen Larson. I am a program officer here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you for joining us this evening for a very timely program on nuclear weapons. We are today just 1 month short of the 50th anniversary of the entry into force of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Before we begin the program, I just have a few quick housekeeping points. Please know that we are on the record this evening and we are live streaming tonight's program. We welcome social media engagement, but please take a moment now to silence your phones. Later, we will be taking audience questions from the room and online. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, simply type ccga.live into your browser and follow the on-screen prompts. And the information will also be circulating on the flanking screens to the right and the left of the stage throughout the program for your reference. I'd also like to remind you that the Council is an independent and nonpartisan platform, and that the views expressed by the individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. This program is part of the Lester Crown Center on U.S. Foreign Policy. A generous gift from the Crown family supports all of the Center's efforts and development of digital resources to make the Council's foreign policy content more accessible across platforms. A very special thank you also to all of our members joining us in the room and online for continuing to support the Council. If you'd like to learn more about membership, I encourage you to sign up for a complimentary Council Open House, which is taking place on February 27th, and all the details for this great event is on our website. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you this evening our speakers. Fred Kaplan is the National Security Correspondent for Slate. Prior to joining Slate, Fred was a reporter for the Boston Globe, where he was bureau chief for Moscow and New York. He is also the author of multiple books, including a Pulitzer Prize finalist and a New York Times bestseller. His very latest release, entitled The Bomb, Presidents, General, and the Secret History of Nuclear War, will be available for sale and signing from our book partner, the bookseller, just here in the back of the room. Fred Kaplan will be joined in conversation this evening by Ivo Daalder. Certainly no stranger to the Council, as most of you know already. Ivo Daalder is the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Prior to joining us at the Council, he served as U.S. Ambassador to NATO from 2009 to 2013. And prior to his appointment as ambassador, Ivo was a senior fellow in foreign policy studies at the Brookings Institution, where he specialized in American foreign policy, European security, and transatlantic relations, as well as national security affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Fred Kaplan and Ivo Daalder to the Council stage.
Thanks for that introduction, though it left out the most important piece, which is that we both have doctorates from MIT Political Science Department. And in fact, the first time I met you and knew of you was when I, as a young doctoral student, got to MIT in the 80s, when you were already at the Boston Globe.
Right.
And of course, you wrote your dissertation, which became a book.
The other way around.
You wrote a book that became a dissertation. Those are the best ones. Called The Wizards of Armageddon.
Right.
And Wizards of Armageddon is a fantastic story about the strategists of the nuclear age, particularly in the earlier part, but all the way to, was it to the 1980s?
Yeah, 83 came out.
And it's sort of like about presidents, generals, and the secret history of nuclear war, the bomb.
Well.
So question, why did you write this when you already wrote the best book on the market?
Thank you. Well, a couple of reasons. First, Wizards of Armageddon was 1983. As much time passed between Hiroshima and the Wizards of Armageddon as between the Wizards of Armageddon and now, which is shorthand for how old we're getting.
Yeah.
But more than that, Wizards, as you say, was about the strategists, the people who invented these ideas of nuclear deterrence, nuclear war fighting. I got a lot of stuff declassified for that book. Freedom of Information was at its peak. I also interviewed everybody. They were all still alive. Then, 30 years pass, nobody's thinking about the bomb. Nobody cares, worries. Then Trump gives his fire and fury speech about North Korea. All of a sudden, everybody's panicked, but in a kind of paralyzed way because they've never thought about this stuff before. Or maybe they did a long time ago and they've forgotten. So I thought, well, this is a good time maybe to revive this and update it. But it turned out that in my absence from that endeavor, a lot of stuff had been declassified about the presidential decision-making that almost nobody has really tapped. So this book is about the decision makers. The strategists are in there a little bit, but this is about the presidents who confronted a crisis that involved considering whether or not to use nuclear weapons. And this happened quite a bit more often than a lot of people think, and how they went about thinking about it. And as I say, when I wrote Wizards, for example, there was almost nothing declassified about what President Kennedy said or thought about nuclear weapons. The tapes, I don't even think people knew tapes existed. Now tapes, transcripts, it's all out there. So yeah, that's the thing. The protagonist of this book is sort of the bomb. And the subtitle, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War, is how different people at different times confronted the dilemmas and horrors of nuclear war.
So it is a different view, and having the president's eye, and
Yeah.
let me tell you, if you have not read the book, it's really a terrific, extraordinarily easily accessible book on a very, very important topic. We don't think about presidents getting close to nuclear war. This president has at times talked about killing hundreds of millions of people, and that would be really bad, as he said, I think, with regard to Afghanistan at one point. But if you go back that history, from 1945, say August 10th, 1945, after the dropping of the 2 bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to today, you now studied that history. At what point did we get closest to nuclear war?
Well, I guess the answer you all might be thinking is the Cuban Missile Crisis. But a year before the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a crisis over Berlin in 1961, most of 1961. It's since been overshadowed by the Cuban crisis, and almost everything about the Berlin crisis has been classified until very recently. So looking at the people in this crowd, I probably don't have to explain Berlin. I mean, a lot of people don't remember that, there was an East Germany and a West Germany, and Berlin was 100 miles inside East Germany, and there was this little enclave called West Berlin, which we were treaty bound to defend, and yet we had no conventional forces in Western Europe to speak of in 1961. And so Khrushchev, when Kennedy comes into office, says, this is really our territory, and we're just going to take it over by the end of the year, and if you try to stop us, it'll be war, and we'll win, because it's our territory. And so there were a series of very serious meetings in the White House, in the Pentagon, in NATO, discussing the use of nuclear weapons, because that was all we had. And Berlin was seen as such a vital piece of it was a vital interest. Nobody even questioned the premise that going to nuclear war was something that we should do to protect Berlin. It wasn't questioned. So this wound up with a series of plans and processes, and they came up with a 4-phase plan. Phase 1, Russians are moving into West Berlin. Phase 1, we send in a patrol. If that doesn't stop it, Phase 2, we send in a brigade. Phase 3, we start doing overflights, economic sanctions, UN resolutions. Phase 4, nuclear. That was divided into 3 parts. 4A, a demonstration bomb. Just blow up a bomb someplace just to show that we're serious about this. Time to back off before things get serious, even more serious. 4.2, tactical nuclear weapons against this incoming Soviet army. Phase 4C, all-out nuclear war. And let me tell you, the war plan at the time, the nuclear war plan was this. If the Soviets invade Western Europe or take over West Berlin, we unleash our entire atomic arsenal against every target in the Soviet Union, the satellite nations of Eastern Europe, and China, even if China isn't even involved in the war. That was the only plan. And somebody once asked, well, how many people are going to be killed in this attack? And the answer was 285 million. So that was the plan that John Kennedy was facing. And if you look at the transcripts of some tapes, or at the time, mostly very careful notes at the meetings, or if you read my accounts of them in the book, which is the easiest way to do it.
Shorter.
He got into this very deeply. He immersed himself deeply in the logic, and he realized, okay, no. He really believed that if there is a war with the Soviet Union, it'll go nuclear. And if we start using nuclear weapons, it'll probably go all the way. And so he sought a way out. And the way that he sought out was very interesting. He came into office believing in the missile gap. Most of you remember the missile gap, this notion in the late 50s that the Soviets were way ahead of us in nuclear weapons. Well, in 1960, they started flying photo reconnaissance satellites over the Soviet Union and discovered not that they had 100, 200, 500 missiles, as some intelligence agencies thought. They had 4. They had 4. Another intelligence revealed that their bombers weren't loaded, their submarines weren't loaded, the missiles were liquid fuel. And in fact, there was some talk in the Pentagon and in the White House of consideration of a sneak first strike against the Soviet forces, which might really work. Except if a couple weapons survived, they could retaliate and kill millions of Americans. So Kennedy decided it's time to tell the Russians that we know they've been bluffing and there is no missile gap and that we're way ahead. And so his Deputy Secretary of Defense, Roswell Gilpatrick, gave a speech right in the middle of a Communist Party Congress. Khrushchev knew his bluff was called, as a result of which he genuinely thought that the United States was gearing up to launch a first strike. He had nothing to fire back with. So he sent medium-range missiles to Cuba. That's how the Cuban Missile Crisis got started. And then, can I just proceed on?
Yeah.
Because there are things about the Cuban Missile Crisis that are still generally not known, even though there are tapes and transcripts of all 13 days of Kennedy meeting with his advisors around the table. It kind of befuddles and confounds me why there are maybe 3 accounts of the Cuban Missile Crisis that take into account all of these tapes. So we now know, because it was revealed 20 years after the fact, that it wasn't quite the case that we went eyeball to eyeball with the Russians and they blinked, but there was a diplomatic solution. Khrushchev came up with this proposal on the last day, which was a Saturday. I'll take my missiles out of Cuba if you take your missiles out of Turkey. And Kennedy said, yeah, sounds good. What is not generally known is that everybody around the table, all of his advisors, not just the military, but civilians, Bobby Kennedy, Robert McNamara, George Bundy, all these paragons of reasonableness, they all thought this was a terrible idea. NATO will be wrecked. Turkey will be humiliated. Our credibility will be in doubt. And Kennedy keeps saying, and this is on tapes, you can hear it, it's fascinating tape. He said, well, any reasonable person, it seems like a fair trade. Any reasonable man at the United Nations will think this is a good deal. He secretly takes the deal. He tells 6 people about it. One of these people was not Lyndon Johnson, who became president and believed the nonsense that a lot of the advisors were still putting out, that this was eyeball to eyeball. And McGeorge Bundy, later in his memoir, said that he regretted perpetuating this myth because it led to unfortunate perceptions about the way to deal with international politics. And he was obviously referring to Vietnam. I mean, it's an interesting question. If Lyndon Johnson had known that this was done by diplomacy, whether he would have behaved in Vietnam differently. I mean, that's an open question.
Clearly, 61, 60. But clearly those are the crises that we all remember. Tom Schelling, who is one of your wizards, a Nobel laureate for economics, but in his Nobel laureate speech, talked about the nuclear taboo.
Right.
And this idea that as presidents start the process of learning about what a nuclear war is all about, the idea that a president could actually push the button gets further and further away as you get further away from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You buy that?
To some degree, yes. Schelling told me once that he was in charge of hosting a lot of war games that involved some officials in the early 60s. And it was the hardest thing he could do to get a war started. especially a nuclear war started. I think of the presidents up till now, and now is still an open question, as I say, even dating back to Eisenhower and all through, they examined the situation. They dug deep into the logic of it, which is what you have to do. It wasn't kind of an innocent, oh, I don't want to do this. They dug deep into the logic, the scenarios, the consequences, and all of them said, I don't want to go there. I have to back out of this thing somehow. The thing that concerns me about Trump, frankly, is that he doesn't dig deep into anything. And remember during the Cold War, there used to be this scare scenario phenomenon called the clever briefer. This was the guy who tells Khrushchev, oh yes, if we use nuclear weapons now in this way against these targets, we might be able to pull it off. And it seems to me, though, that Trump might be more susceptible to the potential clever briefer than any president in the nuclear age. Now, one thing that we've learned, he really isn't terribly keen on deliberately getting into a war. But whether he might slide into one is another question. And there have been a couple of occasions where that's come awfully close, even in the last 3 years.
So related to that, and take Trump just as one of the cases, we've had other cases where president's ability and control of the situation was feeble.
Right.
Nixon running around the White House, sloshing a lot of red wine and all of that sort of stuff. And so the question, even before Donald Trump, is how should we think about this awesome power that a president has? And is that a power that only one, to this point, man should have? The power to press the button? Or is there a structure that we should think about that we really need to start putting in place, that decision can't and shouldn't be just one man's?
Well, Harry Truman was the one who decided to exert civilian control over the bomb because he didn't trust the military. There's a fascinating conversation that's recorded in the diaries of David Lilienthal, his atomic energy commissioner, where Truman is telling his general shortly after Hiroshima, he goes, look, this isn't a military weapon. It kills women and children. It's not like a rifle or a conventional bomb. And so basically, for quite a few years, the military couldn't even launch a nuclear weapon without first going through the Atomic Energy Commission. I mean, it was really cleared off. But ever since then, though, it raises another question. The assumption of his idea is that civilian presidents will always be reasonable. And yet, the founding fathers say in completely different contexts, obviously, that, well, no, we might get a tyrant, an unreasonable guy sometime. So there was a hearing early on in Trump's presidency that was very little covered and completely forgotten now, where the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the chairman, Senator Bob Corker, suddenly realized that, oh my God, the president has the power, legal and otherwise, to use nuclear weapons all by himself without anyone's permission. We need to hold a hearing on this. And Corker at the time was talking about, likening the White House to an adult daycare center and saying Trump's rhetoric is paving a path to World War III. This was the first hearing on the subject held in Congress since the mid-'70s. And one of the Democratic senators said, look, let's drop the pretense. The reason why we're having this hearing is because we have a president who's reckless and doesn't have good judgment. And the curious thing, if you look at the transcript of that hearing, is not a single Republican disputes this premise. But, and they're talking about the possibility of if a missile is coming toward, if missiles are coming toward us and there's 30 minutes to decide, I mean, obviously you can't convene Congress or even the cabinet. The president is the one to. But if you're thinking about launching a preventive first strike on North Korea, say, one can make the point, you should be required to get some consultation there. And there was a bill presented. It wasn't even considered. And at the end of the hearing, nothing happened. And there was a general who was one of the witnesses, a retired general, General Robert Keller, who had been commander of Strategic Command, who came away from the hearing very frustrated because these guys were raising doubts about the reliability of the command structure and yet doing nothing to change it. And this is actually very typical of Congress. I mean, except for a few years after the passage of the War Powers Act in the mid-'70s, they have never wanted to put their signature to any act of war. They don't want the responsibility. They don't want the blame if things go south. You're very familiar with this, obviously.
This is what Congress does best.
Yeah.
Pontificating and not necessarily taking responsibility.
Not doing it.
Right. Part of the theme, so we talked about the decision to use weapons. Another really big theme running through the book is the question of how many and what kind and what strategy to use it for. Mm-hmm. And this tension that exists that presidents face, but that exists in the nuclear strategy field. On the one hand, between it actually is pretty easy to think about how to deter someone,
right?
Which is, if you're able to kill tens of millions of people, you're unlikely to risk that possibility. But on the other hand, if deterrence were to fail, mm-hmm. why would we just start shooting off missiles, but actually can't we figure out a way to minimize damage?
Yeah.
And the use, and that drives up your numbers, and that drives up the kind of counter force strategies
right.
That one have. That's one tension. And the other tension, which you just mentioned with regard to the Cuban Missile Crisis, one I'm intimately familiar with, is it may be good enough for us, but our allies just won't believe that we will use nuclear weapons to defend Berlin or Tokyo while risking New York and Los Angeles. And therefore, we need to have credible nuclear options. Talk a little bit about those two tensions and how...
Well, Kennedy was, I don't mean to keep harping on Kennedy, and we should move on to somebody else too, but Kennedy was the first to realize this dilemma. Shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a conversation on tape between him, Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, and Maxwell Taylor, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, where Kennedy, at first he says, they're discussing the next year's defense budget. And he goes, I don't understand why we're buying all of these nuclear weapons. I mean, it seems to me if you have 40 missiles that can destroy 40 Soviet cities, that should be it. I mean, there were just 24 Soviet missiles in Cuba. I would have been deterred by that. But then as the conversation goes on, he realizes, as you just said, I guess if deterrence fails, I'd want to go after their missiles. And I guess maybe I need more than 40. And so, this creates the dilemma. On the one hand, if all you want to do is deter, just threaten, I'm going to clobber you. But then you have to say, well, to make that credible, because once the Soviets have an arsenal, if we clobber them, they can clobber us. So how credible is that? Then you've got to think about, well, I want to be able to do so in a way to limit damage, maybe bring the war to an end. So to present that as a credible threat, you've got to actually develop plans. You've got to kind of believe it yourself. You've got to have weapons that can do this. And so over the years, there's this convergence of nuclear deterrence and nuclear warfighting as resembling roughly the same thing. Now, at the same time, something else peculiar was going on. And the one thing that I got wrong in The Wizards of Armageddon that I correct here is that Kennedy and McNamara created these limited options, as they were called, where you don't shoot off everything at once. You can have 5 or so different options of limited attacks. One thing I learned from my new round of research is that Strategic Air Command paid no attention to this guidance, which changed things. It remained the all-out thing until well into the 80s, actually. And then well after that, into the early 90s, there were a couple of civilians under George H.W. Bush, civilians in the Pentagon, who got very deep into the PSYOP. They were authorized by, strangely enough, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney to go very deep into the nuclear war plan, find out how many weapons are aimed at what targets and what is the calculation that allows this. And they discovered some amazing things. That, for example, that Moscow was if the war plan were carried out, was targeted, we were aiming 700 nuclear weapons at Moscow, each weapon at more than a megaton in explosive power. There was an air base in the Arctic, which was going to be used for Soviet bombers as they came back from bombing us. And it was so cold that it could only be used like a quarter of the year. There were 17 weapons aimed at this air base. There was an anti-ballistic missile site in Moscow that we learned after the Cold War didn't work at all. 69 warheads aimed at this went on and on. And what really struck them, Bush was negotiating a strategic arms reduction treaty, and one of these civilians asked somebody at SAC, now we're thinking of reducing weapons to a certain number. Would you still be able to carry out your mission? And he said, well, no, that's not the way we think about it. And he starts to rephrase. He goes, no, I understand what you're saying, but that's not what we do. What we do is we take the weapons that we have and we allocate them to the targets that we have. In other words, at no place, there were people in Washington who were asking, how many weapons do we really need? At no place in the actual operational level of this was anybody asking, how many do we need to do X? I mean, whatever your aim is, deterrence, warfighting, whatever targets you want to hit, nobody was asking how many do we need. There was a SAC commander named General Jack Chain who at one hearing said, I need 10,000 weapons because I have 10,000 targets. And at the time, people thought that either he was joking or maybe he wasn't too bright. But no, that's how things were done all the way until really as the Cold War was coming to an end. So, I mean, we really lucked out.
We never got to that point.
No, we never got to it.
But this search for usability.
Yes.
This search for how can I make a nuclear weapon, threaten and make it credible, yesterday reached its most logical conclusion.
You mean with the low?
We now have deployed, the Pentagon announced that we have deployed a low-yield nuclear weapon, 5 kilotons, reportedly.
I've heard 8, but whatever.
So a
Give or
third
take.
to a half of the size of Hiroshima.
Yeah.
On a ballistic missile, deployed on a ballistic missile submarine,
Right.
together with all the Trident missiles, which have multiple warheads and are a little larger. But this idea that the Russians will not believe we're willing to use nuclear weapons, our allies will not believe we're willing to use nuclear weapons unless we can actually use them. So why don't we have a low-yield nuclear weapon?
Well,
That makes sense?
Well, again, this is a similar dilemma. On the one hand, if deterrence fails, as the phrase goes, a phrase you've no doubt heard hundreds of times in your career, thousands maybe, then yeah, you want to maybe be able to bring this thing to an end with as little damage as possible. There were people who were thinking about this back in the early 60s. Those people really didn't quite believe this would work, but figuring, well, okay, even if there's a small chance, let's do it. On the other hand, if you have weapons that aren't going to do a lot of damage, but then you might actually think that maybe you can use them. They become more tempting to use. It goes both ways. You're looking for something that can be used. Therefore, again, in a situation of tension, the clever briefer, you might use it and think that you can get away with it. Now, there was a security conference at Aspen where Michael Gordon, a defense reporter, was asking the questions, and Frank Miller, who was a big advocate of these weapons, was being asked. And Michael asked the question, when you say low yield, what are we talking about? And Frank said, high single digits. Of what? He goes, kilotons. And Michael says, so kind of like Hiroshima. And Frank says, well, you don't want to get pejorative about it. And Michael said, well, I'm not being pejorative. I just want people to realize that we're not talking about firecrackers. 8 kilotons, 8,000 tons, again, which is not that much smaller than Hiroshima, and we've all seen pictures of Hiroshima. Low-yield nuclear weapons still do more damage than anybody has done with a bombing raid, much less a single bomb, since the end of World War II.
So one way out of the dilemma that started under Kennedy, then Johnson, and continued on was arms control.
Yeah.
That if you can't solve this problem by the way you target and deploy your nuclear weapons, you might be able to do it through arms control. The other way we're going to solve this problem is have a treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, that says those who have nuclear weapons can keep them as long as they go down, and those who don't have them won't have them. So next month, March 5th, 50th anniversary of the NPT, today, February 5th, is 1 year until New START expires. Those are the only two major nuclear arms control agreements still in existence. And is that enough? Should we think about something else?
Well, arms control
How
goes.
should we think about that?
Yeah, arms control goes both ways. Every arms control treaty that has been signed, if it's a treaty, it requires 2/3 of the Senate to ratify, and you also have to get an initial endorsement by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. If they say, no, we're not going to go on the Hill and say that we like this, then you're dead in the water. And so what has happened with every treaty is that either the Joint Chiefs or some Republican or even Democratic senators say, okay, I'll go for this treaty, but you need to approve the following nuclear weapons. And most nuclear weapons that were deployed in the 80s, 90s, might not have been deployed if they hadn't been bargaining chips to get during the Obama administration. Obama had to get New START ratified, which he had to do because START 2 was about to expire. He had to raise the budget on nuclear weapons. He had to agree to, as he put it, replace or modernize all three legs of the triad, land-based missiles, submarines, and bombers, which the Republicans then took to mean replace, and drew up a budget that's $1.3 trillion over 30 years, which is not what he intended. But still, Jimmy Carter had to approve the MX missile, which he loathed, in order to get SALT II. So, it's, on the other hand, as you say, New START is about to expire. I mean, New START, even the people who were pulling these shenanigans under Obama, they said, yeah, this is a modest treaty. It doesn't hurt us, really. And so to extend New START, all it would take is some people in a room and they sign it, and that's it. It'll take 5 minutes. Right now, nobody has any plans to exceed the limits of New START. Both sides are building new kinds of nuclear weapons, but they're still allowable under New START. All that goes to the wind without any kind of limitation treaty. The NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, some people say, well, the superpowers haven't done their act. They haven't reduced the number of nuclear weapons. Well, in fact, we have. In 1970, when that treaty was signed, each side had about 25,000 nuclear weapons. Now we have about 1/10 that number. It can still make the rubble bounce more than a couple of times if they were all used. But it is an interesting question. I read books that were written in the early 60s, before the NPT, predicting that by the year 2000, 20 countries would have nuclear weapons. And 20 countries could have nuclear weapons. And, the NPT is one of those things that is constraining people. And also U.S. assurances of allied solidarity, which this president has poked a lot of holes and doubts into. So, no, it's a very dicey time. It's at least one thing that arms control treaties do once they're passed is to create bounds. They bound levels of certainty, and you do away with them, that there are no bounds. I mean, the INF Treaty was repealed. I asked some people in the Pentagon, well, are there plans to build any missiles of this sort? What's the requirement? What do you need these for? Well, we're looking into that. I mean, they wanted to build missiles before they even had a plan, before they even talked with allies about where they would go. And now we are testing missiles that treaty prohibited without any idea, and I'm really not exaggerating here, no idea where to put them, under what scenario to use them, under what concept of deterrence they might be useful. I mean, it's back to, we can do it, so therefore let's do it.
So I'm going to open up in a minute, and one more question. And if you want to ask a question online, please go to ccga.live and fire away with your fingers, not with the nuclear button. So you've now studied, 13 presidents in the nuclear age, I guess, if I calculate that right, somewhere around there. Which one of those presidents do you think grappled best and most deeply with the dilemmas, well, both of use and of numbers?
I mean, I think Kennedy, but let me talk about a president that we haven't mentioned yet who kind of surprised me, and that is Reagan. You know, I was a reporter when Reagan was in office, and what I found went against what I'd thought of the guy. It turns out that Ronald Reagan was sort of a closet nuclear abolitionist, something that his advisors did their best to hide. In fact, he and Edward Teller might be the only two people who believed that the Strategic Defense Initiative, you know, the Star Wars plan that you no doubt remember, actually could, you know, it would be like a shield where no weapons would get through, and therefore we render nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. But he was also, you know, a fervent anti-communist. And these two things were in tension. And of course, in his first term, you know, he boosted the defense budget, said lots of provocative things, and the CIA and NSA were doing very provocative things. And then Reagan realized, oh my God, these guys really think we're preparing to launch a first strike. That isn't my intention. We need to talk to these people. So Gorbachev comes into power. They meet in Geneva for the first time, 1985. The first round of talks, and these are all, you know, they're note takers' transcripts now. You can read them. The first round of talks, very tense, so they decide to go for a walk along the lake, duck into a cabin where a fire is blazing. It's just them and their translators. And Reagan leans into Gorbachev and says, if the United States was attacked by aliens from outer space, would Russia come to our defense? And Gorbachev said, absolutely. And Reagan said, I feel the same way about you. And when they came back to the conference hall, George Shultz, Secretary of State, who had no idea that this conversation had taken place, wrote later that the atmosphere had suddenly changed completely. They were laughing, smiling like they were old friends, and it was that was kind of the pivot that led to the end of the Cold War between these two extravagantly unlikely figures to arise within their own system. But Reagan believed this. A couple years later at a General Assembly speech, he said, and people thought, the Joint Chiefs of Staff tried to scratch this line out 3 times in the speech, and he kept adding it back in. He said, if we were attacked by aliens from outer space, the disputes among us here on Earth would be trivial by comparison. And, you know, on the one hand, this is kind of crazy. On the other hand, hey, you know, there's something to it. And maybe in dealing with something so cataclysmic, you need to look at things from 1 billion miles up. So all kinds of very strange and wild and woolly things in this history.
So let's open it up. If you put up your hand, I will recognize you. We'll get you a microphone so not only everybody here, but everybody in the in our online audience can be there. And we'll go right up front here first. Lisa Harris.
Thank you. Ivo's first question to you was, when in the however many years since Hiroshima and Nagasaki have we come closest to seeing nuclear weapons being used again? You focused on Berlin and U.S. and the Soviet Union. If you set aside the superpower confrontation, is there another place, India, Pakistan, a time when we came as close or closer to seeing nuclear weapons used, even if on a much smaller scale?
I have to confess, this book is a very America-centric book. But yes, certainly India, Pakistan. And in fact, it's interesting. When Colin Powell was Secretary of State under Bush and was being eased out of everything in the high profile by Cheney and Rumsfeld, they let him do things that weren't really in their bailiwick. And one of them was India, Pakistan. And one could say that Powell, by doing his own version of shuttle diplomacy, went a long ways toward preventing a war between India and Pakistan. And, you know, there is a school of thought in international relations which says, hey, the more proliferation, the better. If everybody has nuclear weapons, everybody will be deterred from going to war. Well, you know, maybe, but it's one thing to have 30 minutes of warning time, US, Russia. It's another to have like 2 minutes of warning time. You know, India, Pakistan, Iran, Israel, whatever scenario you want to be. And, you know, these other countries, they don't have the kind of permissive action links, the locks that we do. Who knows what their air defense radars. There are about half a dozen times in our history where one side or the other sees 500 ICBMs coming their way on a radar screen owing to some technical mishap or another. And there are a couple of times where only the common sense of somebody way down on the chain might have prevented nuclear war. So India, Pakistan, I don't know how good their systems or their warning systems are and so forth. So yeah, on the one hand, one could say that because of nuclear deterrence, there are a few wars that probably haven't started because of that. But you know, that's a game that has to work every single time. And if it doesn't work even once, then we're talking catastrophe.
Question here from someone online related to technology. And there's many times when we thought a new technology could sort of change the dynamic of nuclear strategy, starting with the ABM and the anti-ballistic missile defenses and others. There's new technology out there, not thinking about cyber as much, but the hypersonic missile that, for example, that Vladimir Putin has been showing off in his only the way that he can do it. How should we think about the hypersonic missile specifically, which is the question? But is there technology that is going to change this in some fundamental way?
The hypersonic missile, I mean, I've looked into that. I frankly don't understand what the big deal is. All missiles, all ballistic missiles are hypersonic, you know. If the idea is that they will maneuver around and make and disrupt our missile defenses, well, I've got news for you. Our missile defenses, at least the strategic missile defenses, aren't going to work anyway. And if you think they might work, there's a much simpler way to overwhelm them. Fire 2 warheads instead of 1. They've never been tested with 2 incoming targets. Never. And even the 1 warhead tests, which are, and you know where they are, you know where they're coming from, you know when it launches, they've succeeded, I think, 40% of the time. So if that's the concern, one thing that we should realize about Putin, I think on a lot of this stuff he's bluffing. There's no such thing. He talks about a nuclear-powered cruise missile. There isn't such a thing. He talks about a hypersonic missile. You know, Khrushchev did this well. He got a lot of mileage out of, you know, Khrushchev in the late 50s. You say, we're grinding, you know, we're churning out ICBMs like sausages. Well, he wasn't doing anything of the sort. And, you know, this can come back to bite you because Kennedy, his initial nuclear buildup plans assumed that there was a missile gap. And then he found out that there wasn't. And the Joint Chiefs were already insisting that we go ahead with this plan. So Putin is playing a very dangerous game, but we're responding to it. I was talking with somebody I know who is a vice president at a major aerospace company. He didn't quite understand this hypersonic thing either, but his company was putting in applications for a lot of very lucrative contracts for counter-hyper technology or counter-hyper missile technology. So, I mean, we're just getting into, it's getting very Baroque again. It's getting very Baroque.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. May I have a quick question about the use of rogue states as how it affects decision-making? Example, a rogue nation sets off a nuclear weapon, think 9/11. Who do you attack and with what?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we're talking about a ballistic missile, you can actually trace those pretty well, where it's coming from. This is a scenario that's often come up with cyber technology because you can go through dozens of different IPs to get to where we're getting better at tracking that sort of thing. I'm less concerned about the rogue state business. I mean, it was, in the few years after the Cold War, it was a serious problem because Russia was broke. Scientists were getting picked up by the highest bidder. Nuclear materials were being left loose because guards were quitting their jobs. And, that's when Senators Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar were told by people that they'd met over the years from Moscow, they're saying, we're in deep trouble here, and so is the whole world. And they passed this series of initiatives. The United States spent millions of dollars helping to lock up nuclear materials. It's harder to kind of steal some nuclear materials and make a bomb with it than a lot of movie plots assume. Now, if you include rogue states, if say North Korea falls in that category, that's a different story. I mean, I think I won't go into it in detail, but there's a whole chapter in here that for about 8 years, President Clinton kept the North Koreans from further enriching uranium or processing plutonium. North Korea at the time just wanted some economic benefits out of it. We didn't follow through, and they broke the deal. And Bush got out of the deal. Cheney's saying, we don't negotiate with evil, we defeat it. And they built a bomb. And then Bush changed his mind, but it was too late. And Trump thinks he has a contract, that Kim Jong-un signed a contract to get rid of nuclear weapons. No, he signed a one-page agreement which said that we will work toward denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which by North Korea's interpretation means all weapons that could be used to attack the Korean Peninsula, which basically means all of our weapons. So they're not going to do anything until we get rid of all of our nuclear weapons, and that just isn't going to happen. In the meantime, he's enriching more uranium, he's building more missiles. That's another thing I worry about a little bit. Will one day happen when Trump realizes that he's been taken for a big ride by his good friend Kim Jong-un with his beautiful letters and his trustworthiness, and then how pissed is he going to be? And what's he going to do about that? It's a little much to get into in this forum, but during the time that he was talking about fire and fury, there was some very, very serious war planning and exercising going on that could have led to something quite violent and didn't, again, partly out of luck.
One of the things you said, and you have a brief discussion in your book, is something that I worry a great deal about. You said that in the early 60s, in fact, Kennedy was among them, feared that by the end of the century, 20 to 25 nations would have nuclear weapons. And the NPT, in some ways, stopped that. But the way we got countries to sign the NPT, as you mentioned, was we provided nuclear security guarantees to the Germans and the Japanese, both of whom were very late in signing the agreement. As we start having a new strategic context, Russia becomes stronger again, at least more threatening. China certainly becomes stronger. North Korea becomes stronger. The worries of our allies about their vulnerability to possible nuclear attack goes up. At the same time that worries about the credibility of America's security guarantee goes down. And so the question that in 1965 in Tokyo and in Berlin, then Bonn, was should we or should we not keep open the nuclear option, is coming back.
Right.
How worried should we be about this?
Yeah, well, this is a problem, and you're right. I mean, if you read the Non-Proliferation Treaty, there is one clause, is it Article 4, I forget, where basically if you, all you non-nuclear nations, restrain yourself and don't pursue the bomb, we will provide you. It's not like you can develop. We will help you build peaceful nuclear technology. The problem with this is that you can go a long ways toward developing peaceful nuclear technology, including enriching uranium and so forth, and get right up to the point where it suddenly becomes weapons grade and say, okay, I'm out of the treaty now and I have a nuclear bomb. And there's very little transition. This was the concern about Iran, for example. And you're also right. I mean, other countries, Japan foremost among them, I think, have held off from going to nuclear weapons, partly because they're the only country that's been ravaged by nuclear weapons. But, you know, more hawkish people have come into power in Japan, and they look at what had made them relaxed about not pursuing nuclear weapons, namely that, well, if China comes after us or North Korea, well, our friends in Washington will help us. And, you know, Trump has basically said, maybe, you know, if you pay up, I mean, he looks at alliances as a protection racket, and he has said, yeah, maybe they'll get nuclear weapons of their own someday, and maybe that'll be all right. I mean, he's kind of, you know, sanctioned it. So, yeah, and you know, once a couple of nations break off, you know, North Korea had been a signatory for a while. And Iran is now threatening not only to keep doing, but to break the NPT, get out of the NPT. All treaties give you an out. They say you, with 6 months' notice or whatever it is, you may exit from the treaty. As 2 or 3 countries begin to do this, and as they realize, well, God, if Tokyo doesn't really trust Washington anymore, should I trust them? And they, you know, they might go along their way. It's possible, and we don't have. You know, a lot of these countries, we don't even have ambassadors right now. We have acting assistant secretaries that look at the issues from the Pentagon or the State Department. We don't have anybody really keeping an eye. For example, there's a job, the Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs. One of his jobs is to call his counterpart in Japan every day just to kind of pat his hand and say, everything's cool, we're still here, and maybe every month go meet with them. I mean, I'm not exaggerating at all. And we really don't have anybody doing this right now. I mean, that's part of what being a superpower is. It's managing your alliances. And there are people on the mid-level who are very talented and who are still trying to do this. But if you're Tokyo or Seoul or whatever, and you're looking out and you don't see very many links between this assistant secretary and, say, the national security advisor or the secretary of state, then you say, well, this has been a very lovely conversation, but I don't know if it really means anything. And that's a serious problem.
Yeah, in the middle, just the microphone's coming.
Thanks very much for your talk. I really appreciate it. I was associated with the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist for a while as its publisher. And so I'm interested in the role that scientists have played. Some histories of the Cold War suggest that, in fact, there was communication, especially between U.S. and Russian scientists, and that some of those communications helped foster understanding and actually draft treaties. Did you come across evidence in your own research of the role of scientists in some of the decision-making that these presidents, like Kennedy, for instance, were making?
Well, I actually wrote more about that in Wizards of Armageddon, I confess. But no, under everyone from Eisenhower through Nixon and through Carter, really, and actually Obama, the President's Science Advisory Council, is that what PSAC stood for? Anyway, the President's Science Advisor was a very important figure. And he was brought in to all and I say he because I think they all were men, they were brought in to all the high-level discussions about this sort of thing. And they were given a say, and the say was taken very seriously. I mean, he wasn't science advisor, he was Secretary of Energy, but Ernest Moniz had a huge impact on the drafting of the nuclear deal with Iran, because he knew what had to be in the deal to make it airtight. So no, absolutely, and yeah, you're right. The Pugwash group, which was setting up, relations between the U.S. and Soviet Union, and for a while, the Russians were clearly using this as kind of propaganda. These people didn't really have any ties to Khrushchev or Brezhnev either, and yet, what resulted from this was a forum in which then did translate into the kinds of forms for arms control treaties. I mean, for much of the Cold War, arms control was kind of a token. It was the only way that US and Soviet diplomats could talk with each other because they really had nothing much else to talk about. And yet, okay, you could say, well, this was a lot of superficial stuff, and yet, once you sit down and talk with people, a certain climate takes hold. And then they develop some ideas, and this trickles back. So, no, absolutely, scientists, and this I think has also gone away. Scientists in everything, in the EPA, scientists have either been fired or are leaving in droves because their advice has not been taken. They have better things to do with their lives than just tilt at windmills all day long. So, yeah, scientists have had a huge impact in, healthcare policy, global warming, lots of things, and really have almost no impact at all at our present time. And yeah, this is a matter of great concern. I mean, even the virus in China now. I mean, Trump disbanded the White House office that was dealing with contagions. There is no longer a White House official in charge of cybersecurity anymore. There used to be a very talented guy who had been in charge of the super elite hacking operation at the NSA. And say what you will about that, at least he knew what kinds of threats were going to be coming at us because he'd helped invent some of these threats. There's nobody there now. I mean, Bolton, when he was National Security Advisor, kicked out all of these people. And the new guy hasn't brought anybody back in. So I mean, it really isn't when you talk about the Trump administration, it really isn't much of an administration anymore.
You have an interesting vignette about a discussion late in the Obama administration where the president is sitting with the Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, physicist, head of OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology, physicist John Holdren, Moniz, the Secretary of Energy, physicist. They're disagreeing about who's really a real physicist, and they're disagreeing. And Obama says, "What's this, nerd shaming?"
Yeah. Well, because at one point, Ash Carter in particular was getting he has a temper. He's yelling about something, and Obama says, "Oh, we're all friends here," and then. I think the science advisor says we're all physicists. And he was a plasma physicist, and Moniz was a more serious kind of physicist. And Moniz says, well, we're sort of all physicists. And Obama said, are we nerd shaming here? I mean, it's...
Well, that's unfortunately all we have time for. Thanks, Fred, for a really
Sure, it was
fantastic
a pleasure.
Conversation.
Thank you.
Come back again
Oh,
soon.
sure.
Thank you. Don't walk away yet. Books are for sale in the back, and Fred will sign them.
Yep. I brought 3 pens.
3 pens. There you go.